Hi, and welcome to topic 6, which is part 2 of criminal law. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about criminal defenses. Okay, so last week you learned about the elements of the crime. And so we learned about the actus reus, the guilty act or the criminal act, mens rea, the guilty or criminal mind, concurrence of the two, etc. And so, in many ways, you were looking at the criminal justice system through the lens of the prosecutor. So, remember from last week that when a crime is actually defined in state statute, and for a person to be found guilty of the crime, they have to have engaged in, and the prosecutor needs to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused actually engaged in each of the elements of the crime. So to get a prosecution, the prosecutor must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused engaged in or possessed, as with mens rea, each element of the crime. This week, we're going to be looking at the criminal justice system through the lens of the defense attorney. And with that, we're going to be taking a look at criminal defenses. And so the role that the criminal defense attorney plays in the criminal justice system is that they are there to raise doubt about one or more of the elements of the crime. And so to be convicted, you have to demonstrate that the individual engaged in all of the elements of the crime. But to be found not guilty, that since the prosecutor has to demonstrate all of the elements, if you raise doubt about only one of the elements, that's enough to get an acquittal. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different criminal defenses that your textbook talks about. Okay, so the goal of criminal defense is to refute one or more of the elements of the crime. And so one thing that a defense attorney can do is that they can refute actus reus. In other words, they can say that a person did engage in this crime, but it's not the person that you've actually charged. It's not the accused that's sitting here at the defense table. And so if you deny actus reus, you say, you've got the wrong person. My client was falsely accused. And so, a defense attorney can, call into question that the evidence that the prosecutor is presenting to the jury regarding that this is actually the person who committed the crime. And so they might call into question like fingerprints that were at the crime scene, or DNA that was at the crime scene, or the reliability of witnesses at the crime scene, or the reliability of surveillance cameras, etc. Okay. And so, as we know, people are falsely accused of crimes, and they are, yet they are still found guilty. There's a whole group called the Innocence Project that, looks at DNA evidence to basically exonerate people who were falsely accused. So that's one thing that the defense attorney can do. Call into question deny actus reus, or even call into question actus reus. Another thing that the defense attorney can do is that they say, you know what? The criminally accused did engage in this act, but they lacked mens rea. They did not possess the criminal mind. They didn't have the capacity to knowingly and willingly engage in this criminal act. And so therefore they should be excused from this criminal charge, and they need to be found not guilty. So we're going to take a look at the different excuse defenses that a defense attorney can use in order to raise doubt regarding mens rea. Another thing that the defense attorney can do is that they say, you know what? The criminally accused, my client, did engage in this action, but that he was justified in engaging in this action. And so that, yes, they engaged in the criminal act. They knowingly and willingly did it. However, anybody in the same circumstance would have done the same thing. Okay. And so that we'll take a look at the two justification defenses that your textbook examines. Now, one thing your textbook doesn't talk about in great detail is that you can refute the harm. So remember from last class period, we said that you have to demonstrate actus reus, mens rea, the concurrence, but that the person that's when you charge somebody with the crime, it has to be based on the harm that they actually are responsible for. And so the actions of the criminally accused have to be responsible for the harm, right? And so one defense could be to that say that yes, my client engaged in this action and they knew what they were doing, but their action was not did not produce the harm. And so you can call into question or refute harm. An example of that is an older example. It's from 1997, and it's about this person. Her name's Louise Woodward. I doubt any of you remember this case, but that she was a nanny, an au pair. She's from England, and she was doing her nannying in the United States. And she was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. She offered a defense. Her attorneys offered a defense refuting harm, but it was obviously not successful since she was convicted. But what she was accused of is of shaking a baby so hard that the baby had a cerebral hemorrhage and died. Okay, it's called shaken baby syndrome. And so the parents said that on her watch, on the nanny's watch, Louise Woodward got so aggravated with this baby that wouldn't stop crying that they shook it until basically killing it. Louise Woodward said that that's not what happened. That what she said and what her attorney said was that she was trying to soothe the crying baby. It wouldn't stop crying. And then she was bouncing it gently on her knee to try to soothe it and patting the baby's back. And then she laid the baby down for a nap, and the baby went into a coma from a cerebral hemorrhage. What her argument was is that she said that the baby's brain had been damaged earlier that week from a fall that the baby had in the parents' care, and that created a cerebral hemorrhage, and that when she was gently sort of bouncing it and patting its back, it opened up the cerebral hemorrhage, leading to the coma. So she said that she did not create the harm that led to the death of the baby. As we see there, it was not a successful defense. However, it's a good example of refuting harm. But let's dig in and take a look at the excuse defenses and the justification defenses that are developed in your textbook. Okay, so with the excuse defense, the focus is on that the accused should be excused from the criminal action because they lacked capacity to form sufficient intent to be held responsible. What does that mean? It's basically saying that the person who's accused of the crime engaged in the act, but that they didn't have the ability to understand what they were doing, to engage in the action with forethought, knowing and willingly. They didn't understand the consequences of their action. So really think about some of those cases that we read in, here's my dog Theo. Hi, Theo. Think about some of the cases that we read in the Brain on Trial book. I mean, a lot of those are good examples of people who lacked mens rea because they had a brain tumor or they were on drugs for Parkinson's, etc. And so that is what excuse defenses revolve around. They focus on mens rea. And so the defense makes an argument that the defendant did not know that they were committing a crime and that they didn't have the capacity to understand the consequences of their actions. And so let's take a look at the specific excuse defenses now. So one excuse defense that your textbook talks about is duress. And duress is basically that a defendant claims that they were forced or coerced into committing a crime. So for example, let's say that a person robs the bank, but the reason that they robbed the bank is because that there were kidnappers who had killed or there were kidnappers who kidnapped their family, and they were holding it at gunpoint. And they said, look, you either rob this bank or we're going to shoot your family, dead. And so an individual would say, I was so freaked out by the thought that I was going to lose my family that I couldn't even think clearly. I just did what they said because I was so scared and by the thought of them dying. So of course I followed their instructions. And under that kind of duress of your family being killed, that you are not capable of understanding the consequences of your action. You're really not capable of saying, oh yeah, I willingly robbed the bank. No, you didn't willingly rob the bank because you were so scared because your family was being held at gunpoint. So that's an extreme example of duress, but you can think of other examples in the criminal justice system that when somebody is just so stressed out because of something that's happening to them that they engage in a criminal action that you could call into question mens rea. Another excuse defense is insanity. And the insanity defense is basically saying that due to the defendant's state of mind at the time of the crime, that they were insane and it made them impossible to have mens rea. Now, keep in mind that the insanity defense is a legal definition. And so if you say that somebody is so mentally ill at the time that they committed the crime, that they didn't understand the consequences of their action, that they weren't able to actually willingly engage in an act, that is a legal definition, and your textbook talks about that states use different rules in order to define what rises to the legal level of insanity. So it's not a clinical definition. In fact, so if you plead if your defense is insanity, then you could be found not guilty due to insanity. But it's having a mental illness alone is in and of itself not a defense. That you could have a significant mental illness like schizophrenia, but that if the prosecution can prove that at the moment of the crime that you were actually capable of understanding the consequences of your actions and engaging in a willful action, then yeah, you might have a mental illness, but you didn't rise to the level of actually being being insane at the moment you committed the crime. Now, keep in mind that just because it's difficult. A lot of people think it's easy to be found not guilty due to mental disease or defect or due to insanity. That's not the case. It's difficult to prove that in the American criminal justice system. It does happen, though. And just because you are found guilty due to insanity doesn't mean you're like, okay, bye-bye, see you later, go and live your merry life. Usually then the court will there will be a court order to send you to a mental health facility, so that while you may not be criminally liable, that your mental illness is such that you are potentially harmful to yourself and others, and you would be committed to a mental institution via a court order. The two girls who engaged in the Slender Man stabbing that you're probably familiar with if you grew up in Waukesha. The two girls who engaged in that attack, Anissa Weir and Morgan Geyser, they were 12 years old when they engaged in that stabbing, and that they were, even though they both pled guilty to second-degree homicide, the jury actually found them not guilty due to mental disease or defect, and they are both serving time in a mental health facility as a product of that not guilty due to insanity conclusion to their defense. Now, a lot of people might think intoxication calls into question mens rea. That you were so, that you were so drunk that you had no ability to engage in a willful action, right? And it's true. If you got so drunk that you might black out and you'd be like, man, I didn't intend to go kill somebody, but I did anyways. Well, intoxication is, as your textbook points out, as a rule, it's not considered an allowable defense. That the thinking is that that you should have known better, right? If you go into a bar and you get shit-faced drunk, excuse my language, and then you get behind the wheel of a car, that you have knowingly you knowingly engaged in that act because you got drunk, and then even though you didn't know you were driving, that you should have known better. It can reduce the charge from first-degree intentional homicide to either second-degree or some form of manslaughter. So as a rule, it's not considered an allowable defense. The only time it is considered an allowable defense is if the intoxication was involuntary. So let's say that you are taking some medication that has been newly prescribed to you for some disorder that you have, and that as you're taking that, it just totally intoxicates you, like you get medicated to the point of not being able to function. Well, that would be sort of, an involuntary intoxication. You didn't know that those drugs were going to do that to you, and so you're really not responsible for that the actions that came later. You should be excused from that. Same with if you go to a bar and you're like, give me a cranberry juice, and then they, somebody gives you a cranberry juice, and the person sitting next to you, you put some drugs in it, and then you just become, intoxicated to the point of not being able to control your actions. That could be an allowable defense. But if the intoxication is voluntary, while it could reduce the charge, you cannot be excused from the crime. Another excuse defense is age. Okay. And so the thinking here is that the question is can a child willingly and knowingly engage in a crime? Does a child really understand the consequences of their actions? So let's say a child picks up a gun and they're goofing around and they point it at their friend and they're like, I'm going to shoot you. And then they pull the trigger and shoot and their friend dies, heaven forbid, right? Can a child possess mens rea? And the way that this works out in the court of law is that there is when it comes to age, the older the minor defendant is, the more likely that they are presumed capable. And so when it says their age, a presumption of incapacity, what that means is that there's a presumption that this minor is incapable of knowing the consequences of their actions, that they're incapable of possessing the criminal mind. Now, from under the age of 7, so a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old engages in actus reus, right? There is a presumption of incapacitation. So children under the age of 7 will not be held responsible. They will be excused for the criminal act because there's an assumption that they are incapable of possessing mens rea. Over the age of 14, okay, so under 7, that there's no mens rea. Over 14, there's a presumption that the minor does possess mens rea. They presume that they're capable of understanding the consequences of their action. That doesn't mean that a defense attorney couldn't make the case that they lack that capacity to possess mens rea, but that burden is sort of placed on the defense attorney to say that usually a 14-year-old possesses mens rea, but in this case, not so much. Between 7 and 14, that it's sort of halfway between the two. There's not an assumption that they're incapable, and there's not an assumption that they're capable of possessing mens rea, but that they may be held responsible for their actions. But both the prosecutor has to prove that they did possess mens rea, and it makes it easier for a defense attorney to call mens rea into question. And then the final thing we'll talk about on excuse defenses is entrapment. And so entrapment is about police sort of inducing somebody to criminal action. In other words, they didn't intend to commit a crime, but the police badgered them so much, or they tricked them, or they were using deceptive tactics that they were kind of forced into committing a crime through these deceptive or trapping tactics. They used the example in the textbook about the Bear Boys, example about this guy who had possessed child pornography in the past, and that he was convicted for it. He went a really long time without possessing child pornography, but that the cops sort of kept sending him flyers about Bear Boys magazine and like, come on, subscribe to it. And they were just basically like, sort of inducing his criminal action, and finally broke down and got it. And then the cops charged him and arrested him and charged him at that point. And as the textbook points out, that was a classic example of entrapment, that person was induced into that criminal action by the police, and that can be used as an excuse defense. Okay, let's turn our sights now to take a look at justification defenses. So in a justification defense, the defendant acknowledges that they committed the act, and they claim they can't be prosecuted because they were justified in acting. And so they could say, yeah, like they don't really call into question actus reus. They said, yeah, I did it, But that they don't really question mens rea. They said they intended to act in this way. But they basically say that it's not a crime because anybody in a similar circumstance would have done the same thing. And so you acted a certain way and you knew you were acting in a certain way, but because of circumstances, which we'll talk about in a second, the action is actually not a criminal action. So let's take a look at the justification defenses. Okay, the first justification defense that your textbook talks about is consent. And so consent is basically that you had permission to do something, okay? And so consent could be that you had permission to borrow somebody's car. Consent could be that you had permission to enter somebody's home. Consent could be that you had permission to have sex with somebody, okay? And so you could say that, yeah, I entered that person's home. Yeah, I did borrow that person's car. Yeah, I did have sex with that person. But what I did, and I intended to do it, but what I did wasn't a crime because I had consent. The person agreed that I could enter their home. They said it was okay for me to borrow their car. They said it was okay that they wanted to have sex. So so consent and victim consent can become a part of a justification defense. And so that a defense attorney can say that this individual engaged in an action, but they were justified in engaging in that action because they had the consent of the other party to engage in that action. Now, victim consent does not automatically excuse the defendant. It can be an element of the crime, and it's something that can be called into question, consent. And so, when it comes to sexual consent, that a defense attorney, so a prosecutor would say this person didn't have a consent to engage in the sexual act. The defense attorney would say, yes, they did have that consent. Sometimes consent is hard to establish in a court of law, and so that if the burden is placed on the prosecutor to demonstrate that they did not have that consent, and sometimes that is hard to demonstrate, particularly in sexual in sexual affairs, because a lot of times people have sex in the privacy of their own home or in their apartment or their dorm or whatever, and there's not like a tape recording there to like say, they gave me consent or they didn't. But that there are sometimes when people can't give consent, okay? And so in getting consent in some instances isn't even a defense. And so, for example, if an individual is intoxicated, they cannot give consent. So when it comes to sexual assault, if the person says, yeah, they agreed to have sex with me, they said yes, you could say, yeah, but they were drunk. And so they don't have the capacity to give that consent. That when it comes to minors, and minors, just like they don't have the capacity to possess mens rea, they don't have the capacity to grant consent. So if you have sex with a minor and they say, hey, man, the minor consented to it, or I had sex with my daughter, my daughter said it was okay. Daughter's relationship or son's relationship with their parents, a minor's relationships with an adult, they don't have the capacity to form consent. And so in that instance, it's not a defense, okay? And there are some power relationships between a patient and the doctor, or a client and a service provider, that because of the power dynamic, that you can call, the prosecutor can say that the person did not have consent to engage in that action, okay? And so that's something to consider when it comes to justification defenses, whether or not consent was actually procured, and whether or not that consent is actually meaningful consent, because some people drunk, asleep, minors can't give consent. And then your textbook also talks about self-defense, okay? I engaged in this action. I knew what I was doing, but I was justified in doing so because I was defending myself from harm. And so in the 13th, the documentary that you're going to be reading about, you're going to be learning, or the documentary that you're going to be watching, they talk about the Trayvon Martin case and George Zimmerman, who was following Trayvon Martin and then shot him because of the stand your ground law in Florida, and basically saying that George Zimmerman said he feared for his life, and that's why he was justified in shooting Trayvon Martin, and in fact the jury agreed with him. And so the defendant must that he acted with reasonable belief that they were in imminent danger of harm or death, and that there was no means of escape. And you'll read about the different sort of exceptions to self-defense. So oftentimes you have to prove that you are in imminent danger or of death or harm. But if somebody enters, in some states where they have the castle exception, that if somebody enters into your home, you can shoot them and you don't necessarily have to demonstrate that you felt like you were like facing death and that there was no means of escape. And same with the stand your ground laws. So take a look at those. Okay, so you get an opportunity to earn some extra credit points this week. By applying the concepts that you learned in this chapter, both the elements of the crime and also the excuse and justification defenses that we just learned about in this video. And so you get a choice. There's a case study, and we'll take a look at the case study. It's on the next slide. It's really tiny print. So the case study itself will be like uploaded to the Canvas site under topic 6 so that you can like look at it in more detail, and the assignment will actually be described. And so you choose one for this, that you get to say that you want to either be a prosecutor or a defense attorney. And then based on the case study, that you're going to look at the case study and you're going to act like a prosecutor, and you're going to think about the elements of the crime, and that you're going to prove that Mr. Smith, who is the criminally accused in the case study, is guilty of second-degree murder. Or you can act as a defense attorney. Okay, so you choose one. Don't do both. Choose one. If you want to do both, go for it. But to earn the points, you only need to choose one. And so that you can, using either the excuse or justification defense, you can make a case for why your client is not guilty. You can also call into question actus reus, and you can also call into question, you could say, you know what? This person didn't engage in the harm that he is being charged with. So you can call that into question as well. So all of those things we talked about in this lecture about the doubt that the defense attorneys can raise. And see Canvas topic 6 module for more details. But let's take a look at the case study, even though it's presented in kind of really tiny print. I know that I said this was going to be tiny print, but I thought, hey, just make 2 slides so the print won't be so small. And so here's the case study. All right, so there is a defendant. His name is Steve Smith. He's a veteran of the Iraq War. He served 3 tours of duty over a 4-year period of time. So he was in the Iraq War, saw a lot of combat in a very short period of time. He's no longer on active duty, but he suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he also struggles with substance abuse. He kind of self-medicates due to the mental stress that he is experiencing from being involved in fighting a war. Now, one night he is out with his fellow veterans and was involved in a verbal confrontation with another man. His name was Bob Jones, at the bar that they were at. And Mr. Jones was yelling at Mr. Smith. He was calling him names, really demeaning him, calling him a baby-killing soldier, telling him thanks for nothing, that you guys are just a bunch of killers, you deserve to die, like just really going on and on. Mr. Smith knew he needed to get out of this situation. Being verbally accosted like that was really upsetting him. It was kind of triggering his post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so he left the bar immediately after the fight, walking to his car. Mr. Jones followed Mr. Smith to his car, continuing with that same line of taunting and yelling angry remarks at him. Now, before reaching his car, Mr. Smith, in a fit of anger, so remember, Mr. Jones is following Mr. Smith out in the parking lot. And before Mr. Smith reaches his car, in a fit of anger, he turns and stabs Mr. Jones, resulting in Mr. Jones being taken to the ER, where he died about 2 days later as a result of the stab wound. Surveillance cameras in the parking lot captured the attack on film. According to eyewitnesses and medical staff at the ER, it took a while to get medical attention for Mr. Jones. Between the stabbing and the death, Mr. Jones was dropped twice while being carried to the ER by fellow bar patrons. The ER was really close to the bar, and so they just kind of carried Mr. Jones over there. And furthermore, the attending physician who was dealing with a series of emergencies did not realize the serious extent of Mr. Jones's wounds, and Mr. Jones did not receive immediate attention. Despite these factors, the prosecutor charged Mr. Smith with second-degree murder. Okay, that's the case study. I will post that along with the instructions on the Canvas site, and you'll have, obviously a week to turn that in for up to 10 extra credit points. And keep in mind that while you do get the extra credit points, this also serves as a good practice for a question that's going to be on the midterm exam. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.